The lawmakers in Illinois passed SB 3019. It's a 0.2% tax. Now, you might say initially, that's nothing. It's a nuisance. It's hardly even a percent. Go ahead and pay it. It's not a problem. But it's the principle, because today it's a 0.2% tax. But, when the Illinois government needs more money, all of a sudden it goes from 0.2 to now it's a 2% tax, and maybe a 5% tax, and maybe it's 20% tax on digital asset transactions. This reminds me when you play Boardwalk, and there's that little property between Park Place and Boardwalk, and it's called luxury tax. And you're always broke, and then you get hit this luxury tax, $75, which was a lot back then. And that's kind of what this tax is. They call it a privilege tax. It's not a sales tax. It's not an excise tax. It's a privilege tax. When do we get taxed on our privileges? So any crypto exchanges, and I don't know of any, but any exchanges or brokers operating in Illinois would be subject to this tax. Any company like Coinbase would be subject to paying this tax because it operates in Illinois. So if you allow it to creep in at 0.2%, then you're toast. Let me give you a historical illustration of this. Before the American Revolution, there were a lot of Scotch and Irish people who had been aggressively punished by the British government with heavy taxation and abusive administration. They fled to America for a better life. They saw how England operated. They saw how they started small and then started demanding and demanding. So in Boston, all of a sudden, the English government imposed a 2% tax on tea. Very small, a 2% tax. But these Scotch and Irish expats had seen this happen before, and they weren't going to let it happen again. And they'd seen where this went. So they had what's now known as the Boston Tea Party. Under cover of night and disguise, they went on to ships that contained all this tea, and they broke open the containers, threw it into the sea, and destroyed the tea. All this tea had money that was going to go back to the English government. And it really set the English off because they realized that they would not even accept a 2% tax. Now, should the government be free to assess a 2% tax? Well, sure. But this tax involved taking money from the colonists and sending it all back to the British Isles. And it was nothing to do with local compensation, helping the local people. It was confiscatory. It was the beginning of a downward spiral of more taxation. That's what they saw. And that's exactly what we're seeing here with Governor Pritzker and the Illinois Digital Asset Tax Act, which is a beginning to confiscate money from digital asset investors, people who hold that in all sorts of ways. What's this going to do, honestly? It's going to bring in very little money, but it's the principle of it. They're going to start to jack it up higher and higher, and they're trying to confiscate wealth from people who have affluence, which they assume are digital asset people. Now, what if you're living in Illinois? What's your alternative? Well, it could be just one more reason justifying leaving the state and moving somewhere else. This would be a reasonable thing to do, and let the state go down and suffer its own demise. So I think ultimately we saw New York did this. Look at New York. They restricted cryptocurrency activity. Then they've done other things. Look at it now. New York is at risk of losing the New York Stock Exchange, looking at, leaving the state. Billionaires have left the state. Millionaires, financial industries are leaving New York. And this is exactly what's going to happen to Illinois. Now, Illinois is not a big financial center like New York is, but people are not going to accept this sort of level of corruption, which is confiscatory, in a government that's spending outside of its pocket. Now, the government's great at demanding reasons why they need more money. What they're not good at is responsibly using that money and keeping the people they pay accountable. So there's going to be immense amounts of fraud in Illinois, just as we saw in Minneapolis and California. It's a privilege that we should get the profits of our investments. And why should the government be entitled to tax our privilege of doing that? It's anti-free investment. It's anti-people. It's anti-growth. What it is pro-corruption, because it generates more income for a government that's irresponsible in managing its own payouts.